The dust rose in slow spirals from the old auction yard as the sun pushed through a pale morning sky. Ranchers leaned on rails that had been sunburned for decades, their boots coated with a layer of dirt that seemed older than most of the men standing on it. Horses shifted restlessly in the pens, ears flicking at every sound. Some were proud and polished, the kind of horses that drew eager hands and quick bids. Others stood quietly, knowing they did not draw the same admiration. That morning, the place felt heavy with judgment, hurry, and the unspoken rules of the livestock trade. Near the far end of the yard, where the boards were cracked and the shadows lingered even in daylight, stood a horse no one seemed to care about. His coat, once bright, was dull and matted, and one of his legs trembled now and then as if each step drained him. People gave him only brief glances. A few shook their heads. Some muttered that he should never have been brought here. A couple of buyers pointed him out only to snicker or talk about how auctions always had one or two hopeless cases. He had no name on the tag, just a faded number and a streak of dried mud across his flank. The auctioneer didn't look pleased either. He frowned at the trembling horse and flipped through his papers with a sigh. When the horse was finally led toward the ring, most of the buyers stepped back as if the sight was not worth their time. The yard buzzed with the sound of indifference. Even the cowboys who normally joked loudly turned quiet. Something about the horse made everyone retreat in their own way, as if they had already decided there was no future for him. Among the crowd was a young man who stood apart from the others, not by appearance but by the way he watched the horse. His clothes were simple and worn, and he looked like someone who had worked from dawn to dusk most of his life. His hands rested on the rail of the pen, and he seemed unaware of the noise and bustle around him. He watched the injured horse with an expression that wasn't pity or judgment. It was curiosity mixed with something deeper, something thoughtful. No one noticed him except the old gatekeeper who had worked there longer than anyone could remember. The gatekeeper glanced at the young man as if trying to understand what he was thinking. Most people came to the auction for fast deals or strong horses ready for work. But this young man's gaze lingered on the one animal everyone else had dismissed without hesitation. When the handler tugged the rope to move the injured horse forward, the animal stumbled. A few ranchers shook their heads. One man yelled that he didn't have all day. The auctioneer tapped his gavel impatiently, trying to move things along. The horse steadied himself with effort, raising his head a little despite the discomfort. That small act caught the young man's attention even more. The horse didn't look like a champion, he didn't look useful. But there was something in the way he braced himself, something that suggested he still had strength left, even if the rest of the world refused to see it. The sun climbed higher, warming the metal rails and baking the dust into a thin crust. Horses with glossy coats were led around the ring, drawing cheers and confident bids. Their hooves thudded proudly on the dry ground. Buyers pushed forward to get a closer look. Deals were made in minutes. But when the injured horse's turn came, the excitement faded. The crowd grew restless, almost irritated that he was next. The handler pulled the rope again, urging the horse forward. The animal tried to comply, but his gait was uneven and pained. The murmurs grew louder. Most people turned away completely, waiting for the next horse to come out so the energy could rise again. The auctioneer cleared his throat and called out the starting price, a number far lower than any other horse that morning. No one lifted a hand, no one even blinked. The silence stretched in a way that felt cold. The auctioneer lowered the price, still no reaction. A woman near the back whispered that the horse would never make it through the season. A man beside her nodded and said he wouldn't take the animal even if it was free. Someone near the rails muttered that it would be kinder to put him down. The injured horse stood there, breathing hard, blinking slowly as if the world around him grew smaller with every passing second. The young man watched all of it. He saw how the crowd looked through the horse as if he wasn't even standing there. He saw how the animal's ribs shifted with every breath and how his injured leg quivered under the weight. But he also noticed the spark that had not gone out. The horse still tried. He still wanted to stay on his feet. He still lifted his head every time the handler tugged the rope, refusing to collapse. The young man stepped forward. No one noticed at first. He moved quietly, threading through the crowd until he stood at the edge of the ring. The auctioneer called out one last reduced price, sounding more tired than hopeful. And that was when the young man raised his hand. The auction yard fell silent again, but for a different reason. A few people turned to see who had made the bid. When they saw it was the young man, some whispered to each other. A few shook their heads. One rancher near the rail chuckled as if the young man had made a foolish decision. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, then asked for any counterbids. None came, no one else wanted the injured animal. And so, with a tired tap of the gavel, the auctioneer declared the horse sold. The handler looked relieved to move the horse out of the ring, even if he thought the buyer was wasting his money. The young man walked toward the horse with a steady calm. As soon as he stood beside him, the horse's ears flicked forward. For the first time all morning, the animal's eyes held something other than fear or exhaustion. They held wonder. When the young man placed a gentle hand on the horse's neck, the animal did not pull away. He stood still, breathing in the quiet presence beside him. It was as if he finally sensed a person who did not see him as a burden or a lost cause. The young man stroked the rough coat, moving slowly to avoid causing discomfort, and in that moment something shifted around them. It felt like the beginning of a bond, fragile yet powerful. The young man didn't say anything. He simply held the rope and walked with the horse toward the far corner of the yard. But the crowd watched them go, their earlier indifference replaced by a strange hush. People whispered that the young man would regret it. Others shrugged it off. But no one could deny that something unexpected had happened. When he reached the quiet road just outside the auction grounds, the young man paused. He looked at the horse, and the horse looked back, tired but trusting. The sun was higher now, casting a clear light across the man's face. He had no idea what kind of journey lay ahead. He didn't know the challenges or the tests that awaited him. All he knew was that he had made a choice that felt right. He tugged the rope lightly, and the horse took a shaky step beside him. That simple step marked the beginning of a story no one at the auction could have imagined. A story that would rise far beyond the dusty yard, far beyond the whispers of doubters, and far beyond the limits anyone had placed on the injured horse. As they continued down the long road, neither of them noticed the small group watching from the distance. Their eyes followed the young man and the horse with a look that carried concern, curiosity, and a hint of something unspoken. The wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and faraway trails. The road stretched on ahead, and something waited for them just beyond the horizon, something that would test their courage and change their lives long before they reached their destination. The young man stood there with his hand still resting on the horse's rough coat, feeling the animal breathe slow and shallow beneath his palm. The auction yard around him carried its usual noise, yet something in the air had shifted the moment he stepped closer to that injured horse. The introduction ended with him deciding not to walk away, but his resolve was only beginning to form. Now, as he took a quiet step back, he tried to understand why he felt such a pull toward a creature everyone else treated like dust on old boots. His name was Clay. He had grown up around ranch work, but he had never owned a horse of his own. He knew enough to recognize the difference between a horse that was simply worn down and one that carried stories behind its eyes. The injured horse in front of him was not just tired or neglected. It looked like it had lived through seasons of hardship, the kind that tested an animal from its bones to its spirit. Yet even in its pain there was a spark that refused to dim. Clay felt it like a quiet challenge. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the lot as another horse was led to the front. Buyers shouted their offers, dust floated in slow patterns across the ground, and the air smelled of hay and sun-baked wood. Clay should have been paying attention to the real bargains, the horses with clean coats and steady hooves, the ones ranchers were fighting over. Instead, he kept glancing back at the injured horse tied loosely near the back fence. It had not even been presented properly. The handler barely looked at it, as if ashamed to bring the animal forward. Clay studied the horse again. One leg held more weight than it should, a sign of strain. The coat was dull, hiding the true color beneath. The ribs showed lightly, but not from simple lack of feed. Clay had seen enough animals to know when a horse had been pushed far past its limits. But he also saw something else. There was a steadiness in the way the horse held itself, a quiet pride refusing to leave, even as buyers ignored it. The man standing beside Clay nudged him with the edge of his elbow. He was an older rancher with a sun-worn face and small lines around his eyes. "Son, you don't want that one," the man murmured, without looking at Clay. "That horse is all trouble. Folks say it's been passed around more times than a bad penny." Clay listened but kept his eyes on the animal. "Where'd it come from?" The rancher shrugged. "Hard to say. Last handler didn't leave a name. Some think it might have been worked in the hills. Others say it came from a breeding farm that fell apart. Rumors everywhere." "Nothing good." Clay's jaw tightened a little. "Rumors were easy to create. Truth took time. Why isn't anyone bidding on it?" Clay asked. The rancher chuckled low. "Because they want horses that look good walking onto a ranch. Not one limping in like it barely made it. Something's off with its past. And most folks don't want to deal with an injured horse when there are smoother choices." Clay nodded politely, but the rancher's words didn't change how he felt. Instead, they pushed him to look deeper. He walked closer to the fence. The horse lifted its head slightly. Not in fear, more in curiosity, as though it wondered why anyone would bother stepping near it. Clay took a slow breath. He knew he was getting pulled into something larger than he understood. The horse blinked once, steady and calm. Clay felt the moment settle between them like a silent agreement. He returned to the stands, waiting for the auctioneer to finish the next round. Buyers were starting to thin out. The afternoon sun was lowering, stretching long shadows across the dusty ground. Then finally, the auctioneer cleared his throat and motioned for the handler. "Next up, we've got one more." The injured horse was led forward. The crowd barely reacted. The auctioneer tried to sound lively, but even he knew no one wanted this one. His voice softened as he listed a few details. "Older stock, needs care, no papers on file. Bidding starts low." Silence followed his words. Clay's heart picked up. He was not sure why. He only knew that if he stayed quiet, the horse would be taken somewhere worse. Maybe even sent off to be discarded for good. Clay's stomach tightened at the thought. Before he could talk himself out of it, he raised his hand. The auctioneer looked relieved. "We've got a bidder." No one countered. Not a single rancher shifted or raised their hand. It was as if the whole place exhaled, satisfied to let Clay take on the burden. The hammer dropped. Clay had just bought a horse. The handler brought the horse back to him, and up close, Clay could see more details. The eyes were soft but tired, the kind of tired that came after seasons of being pushed without care. Clay reached out slowly. The horse did not pull away. The trust might have been small, but it was there. As he led the horse out of the auction yard, a few people watched quietly. Some shook their heads, others whispered. Clay ignored them. He focused on each step the horse took and how it handled the weight on its injured leg. He walked slow, matching the horse's pace, letting it feel out the ground. Once they reached the old truck he had borrowed from his uncle, Clay paused. He placed his hand on the horse's neck again, feeling the warmth beneath the rough coat. "You and I," Clay whispered gently, "we're going to figure this out." He loaded the horse into the trailer with patience, giving it all the time it needed. The horse hesitated but stepped in, trusting Clay enough to follow him. Clay secured the gate and stood there for a moment, thinking over what he had just done. This was not just a simple purchase. It felt like the start of something bigger. The road back to his uncle's ranch was long, and the trailer rattled softly behind the truck. Clay kept glancing in the mirror, watching for any sign that the horse was struggling. When he finally pulled up to the small barn, the sky was turning orange with the last light of day. He guided the horse into an empty stall lined with clean straw. The barn smelled of hay and warm wood, a safe place compared to the auction yard's chaos. Clay gently touched the horse's muzzle. The animal leaned slightly into his hand. Clay smiled a bit. Whatever this horse had been through, it still had room for trust, and that was something rare. But as the horse shifted, one thing became clear. Its injury was not simple, not just a strain. Clay could see it now under the lamplight. Something deeper lingered there, something that would take more than rest to heal. Clay swallowed hard. He knew he had taken on more than he expected, yet he also knew he could not go back. Something in him had already tied itself to the horse. He stepped back, leaning on the stall door, and let out a slow breath. He had saved the horse from the auction, but saving it completely was another story. Tomorrow he would need answers, real ones, about the horse's past, its injury, and why so many people turned away. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but the truth would not stay hidden for long. The days that followed pushed the young man into the kind of pressure he had never known, and every moment with that injured horse felt like a reminder of how fragile hope could be. The horse was stronger now, but strength alone did not erase doubt. The local ranchers had begun whispering, not out of meanness, but out of that practical caution people learned from living close to the land. Some of them dropped by the ranch just to see whether the young man had taken on more than he could handle. One older rancher leaned on the fence and watched the horse limp across the paddock before turning away with a quiet shake of his head. The young man saw it and felt his stomach sink because he knew what that meant. Folks had already written the animal off, and if he failed, they would simply say they saw it coming. Yet each morning he kept showing up at the paddock with a steady hand and quiet voice. He carried the same patience he had learned from years of working with livestock. He brushed the horse with slow strokes, talking to him as if the horse could understand every word. Maybe he did. There was something about the way the horse watched him, not fearful anymore, but thoughtful, almost weighing the young man the same way the world was weighing the horse. The young man believed healing came from more than medicine. It came from the trust slowly forming between them, and he guarded that trust like it was gold. Training began again in small steps, leading the horse along short paths, asking him to lift his injured leg without forcing it, walking beside him rather than pulling him forward. There were days when it looked like progress, and there were days when the limp looked worse than ever. The young man kept notes on every session, trying to understand what helped and what didn't. He read every old ranch manual he could find, even talked to a retired trainer who lived near the canyon. That old trainer told him that some horses carried emotional wounds that slowed the body more than any physical injury. The words settled heavy in the young man's mind, and for the first time he wondered if he was chasing a dream that the horse had no strength left to share. Still, he refused to quit. He knew champions were made by refusing to step back when everything inside them said they should. The horse had been ignored at the auction, judged by a few glances and a limp, dismissed like he was a burden no one wanted. The young man had felt something when he looked at that horse in the auction yard. It wasn't pity. It was a pull, strong and strange, like the moment had been trying to speak to him. And he wasn't prepared to let that feeling fade just because things were getting hard. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to change. Other animals seemed calmer when the young man and horse worked near them. Even the wind-worn barn felt different, as if it carried a new kind of energy. Visitors noticed, too. A traveling farrier who stopped by to check hooves pointed out that the horse's posture had changed. He said it didn't look like an animal giving up anymore. It looked like one starting to fight his way back. That comment stayed with the young man all evening. He sat beside the horse in the paddock as the sky shifted from orange to blue. The horse lowered his head near him, and the young man felt a quiet connection growing stronger between them. The conflict came from more than just time and injury, though. A local riding event was coming up, and people had already started asking whether he planned to enter. The young man didn't answer, mostly because he didn't know. Competing with a fully healed animal was hard enough. Doing it with a horse that had come from such a broken place almost felt impossible. But the idea stuck in his mind like a seed. If the horse could get strong enough, if he could move with confidence again, maybe they could show the whole town what second chances looked like. It became a thought he carried around all day, even while he tried not to let the pressure of it crush him. One morning, before the sun climbed over the ridge, he brought the horse to the training pen. The air was cold, and he shivered as he adjusted the bridle. When he let go of the lead rope, the horse trotted forward with a steadiness the young man had not seen before, his heart hammered with a rush of hope. It was enough to make him imagine the horse running under an arena's bright lights. But halfway through the circle, the horse stumbled. Not a small stumble, but one that sent dust rising around him as he fought to catch his balance. The young man hurried to him, fear gripping him so tightly he felt it in his spine. The horse steadied himself, breathing hard. The stumble didn't look like a re-injury, but it was enough to remind the young man that they were racing against something unpredictable. It wasn't a simple story of injury to recovery. It was a climb, steep and uneven, with setbacks waiting around every bend. He wiped dust from the horse's muzzle and whispered reassurance, even though part of his courage slipped away in that moment. But quitting never crossed his mind. He slowed the training after that, returning to the basics, walking, gentle exercises, light stretches. Days passed, then a week, then two, and the horse slowly regained the confidence he had lost with that fall. The young man could feel the shift, small but clear. The horse no longer hesitated when entering the training pen. He no longer kept his injured side turned away in guarded tension. He moved with a steadiness that made the young man believe the setback had hurt the horse's pride more than the injury. Tension also brewed outside the ranch. A buyer who had been at the auction started asking questions around town about the horse. People said he had left the auction angry after losing a bid on another animal. Some claimed he believed the injured horse should have been put down, not sold. Rumors traveled quickly in small places, and the young man heard every version of the story from different lips. It left him uneasy. Not because he feared confrontation, but because he feared someone might see the horse as worthless again. He had fought so hard to show the animal that he mattered. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to undo that work with careless words or selfish motives. One evening, as the sky dimmed, the young man walked the horse through the quiet pasture. The wind carried the smell of sage, and the world felt still enough to breathe hope again. He stopped near the fence to rest. The horse stood close beside him, so close that he felt the warmth of the animal's breath against his shoulder. In that moment, he realized the horse wasn't just healing. He was forming a bond deeper than anything the young man had expected. A bond built on trust and shared struggle. A bond that felt strong enough to carry them into whatever came next. He looked at the horse, really looked, and for the first time he thought that maybe this wasn't about creating a champion for the world to see. Maybe it was about proving something to themselves. Proving that things discarded by others could rise again. Proving that patience, kindness, and belief carried their own kind of power. He returned to the barn with a new determination. The conflict was still in full force, the future still uncertain, but he felt something shifting inside him. The training needed to continue, the trust needed to deepen, and he needed to prepare for the moment when everything they had worked for would be tested in front of others. The ranch was quiet as he latched the stall door. The horse lowered his head and watched him with eyes that seemed far more aware than before. It felt like the horse understood that a bigger test was coming, and the weight of that understanding settled across the young man's shoulders. He stepped back from the stall, heart steady but heavy with anticipation. Everything they had been working toward was nearing a point where it would matter more than ever. The conflict was no longer between doubt and belief inside his mind. It was stretching outward, pulling other people into it, pulling the past into it, pulling every fragile piece of the horse's recovery into the open. He knew the next chapter would bring the hardest moments yet, the kind that defined whether dreams broke or transformed. And with the ranch quiet around him and the horse watching him as though waiting for a promise, the young man felt the pressure tighten even more. What lay ahead would test them in ways neither of them fully understood, but they were already too far in to turn back. The days leading toward the riding event crept by with a mix of quiet hope and tightening tension. Every morning the young man woke before sunrise, already thinking about the horse. He moved through chores without wasting motion, his mind replaying everything they had practiced, everything they still needed to fix. The horse had grown steadier, but the young man knew steadiness was not the same as readiness. And readiness was what they needed now. The pressure settled around him like the cold air before a storm, not loud but impossible to ignore. He walked into the barn with a lantern one early morning and found the horse waiting at the front of the stall, ears forward, eyes bright. That alone caused his chest to warm because he remembered the auction yard, when the horse could barely lift his head. Now he stood tall, with a spark that refused to die. It made the young man believe they were close to something important. Something worth fighting the world for. He brushed the horse's coat, feeling the muscle that had slowly returned. Every stroke reminded him how fragile progress still was. One misstep, one bad day, one mistake could undo months of work. Training sessions grew more serious. The young man introduced more difficult movements, letting the horse test his balance in ways that challenged both of them. Sometimes the horse responded with clean, strong steps that made hope rise in the young man's chest. Other times the old weakness flickered back, not enough to break him, but enough to remind him of the past that still lingered in the horse's bones. During those moments, fear whispered in his mind, asking whether he was forcing too much or not pushing enough. He wished there were clearer signs, clearer answers, but all he had was instinct and heart. The event was inching closer, and whispers in town grew louder. Folks wondered if the injured horse could handle it. Some admired the young man's courage, while others quietly questioned his judgment. He overheard two ranchers talking at the supply store, one saying that the horse had spirit, but spirit wouldn't fix a weak leg. The other said the young man would break his own heart if the horse stumbled in front of a crowd. The young man didn't respond because their words cut too close to his own fears. He carried that weight home, but he never let the horse see it. When he walked into the barn, he forced his worries down and reminded himself that doubt had never healed anyone. The conflict deepened when the buyer from the auction returned to the area. People said he was staying at a ranch nearby, asking again about the horse. The young man didn't understand the buyer's interest, but he knew it wasn't good. A man who believed the horse should have been discarded wasn't likely to show up out of concern. There were moments when the young man caught sight of a stranger watching from far off, a silhouette near the fence line or by the road. He couldn't prove it was the buyer, but each time he felt the hair on his arms rise. He knew the horse was vulnerable, not just physically but legally. A mix-up in the auction paperwork had never been fully settled, and though the horse was in his care, he feared someone might try to twist the situation. One late afternoon, the young man found fresh boot tracks near the pasture gate. He knelt, studying them. The prints were too deep, meaning someone had stood there for a while. The horse had been restless that morning, pacing the fence line. Now the pieces connected, and a chill ran through him. Someone had been close enough to touch the rail, maybe close enough to reach through. He scanned the pasture, checking for injuries or signs of agitation. The horse seemed fine, but the idea of someone lurking near him made the young man's jaw tighten. He reinforced the gate and checked every latch twice that night. The ranch felt different now, not just a place of healing, but a place he needed to defend. When he walked the horse under the moonlight, he did it with a protective edge he had never felt before. The horse seemed to sense it and stayed close, brushing the young man's arm lightly with his muzzle. That simple gesture steadied him, reminding him why he was fighting so hard. As training intensified, the horse began showing flashes of the strength the young man believed had always been hidden beneath the injury. There were moments when the horse lifted into a smooth trot that looked almost effortless, his stride stretching longer than it ever had. These moments filled the young man with a rush of warmth, but they also made him nervous. Triumph and danger were tangled together now. The closer they came to success, the more he felt the weight of everything that could go wrong. He started training in new areas of the ranch, wanting the horse to adjust to different ground and new distractions. On one windy afternoon, they rode near the old riverbed, where the earth dipped into a narrow trail. The wind whipped through the brush, carrying loose dust around them. The horse walked with steady steps at first, but as the trail narrowed, the young man saw his ears flick back in uncertainty. He stroked the horse's neck, whispering encouragement, guiding him forward with patience rather than force. Midway down the trail, a loud crack rang out across the canyon. It was probably a loose branch snapping in the wind, but the horse tensed, muscles tightening. The young man held the reins gently, but the horse stiffened and shifted his weight unevenly. Fear surged into the young man's throat. He dismounted quickly, placing a calming hand on the horse's shoulder. After a long moment, the horse relaxed again, but the young man felt shaken. The horse had almost reacted the way traumatized animals did, and it reminded him that the past was not fully gone. Healing was not a straight line. The thought gnawed at him for the rest of the day. Back at the ranch, he worked on helping the horse face those triggers with slow exposure. He set up training challenges that mimicked unexpected sounds or sudden movements, always staying careful not to overwhelm the horse. It was delicate work, and some days he felt like he was walking a tightrope. The horse needed to grow stronger, but he also needed to feel safe. Pushing too hard could undo everything. Not pushing enough could leave them unprepared for the event. Meanwhile, the tension with the buyer grew. People said he had been asking around about the horse's value, even offering money to folks who might know the animal's whereabouts. The young man heard that the buyer had stopped by a local bar and made comments about unfinished business. When word reached him, the young man felt the pressure build even more. It wasn't just about the riding event anymore. Someone else wanted something from the horse, and the young man wasn't sure what kind of trouble that could bring. As the event approached, the young man worked late into the evenings, preparing gear and refining routines. The horse moved with more confidence each day, but the young man could feel time closing in around them. Every improvement felt fragile, every setback felt threatening. The ranch no longer felt like just a home. It felt like the center of a storm gathering around them. The night before their final week of preparation, the young man stood in the barn after feeding. The horse leaned his head over the stall door, breathing softly as if checking on him. The lantern light flickered across the horse's coat, revealing how far the animal had come from the thin, aching creature he once was. The young man reached up, placing his hand on the horse's cheek. In that quiet moment, he realized how much this journey had changed him too. The pressure, the fear, the work, the hope. It had carved him into someone stronger, someone willing to risk everything for the chance to see this horse shine. But even as that strength grew inside him, the threats circling them tightened. A neighbor stopped by to warn him that the buyer had been seen near the ranch road earlier that day. The young man thanked him, but worry flickered in his chest like a flame struggling in wind. He locked every gate and checked the barn twice before turning in for the night. Sleep came slow and shallow. At one point he woke to the sound of the horse moving in the barn, and he rushed out with a lantern only to find the horse calm and resting. Still, he stayed a while, sitting against a bale of hay, listening to the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. With the event now close enough to taste, everything inside him felt stretched tight. The hope, the fear, the determination, the threat from the buyer, the pressure of the upcoming test, the lingering injury, the fragile trust they had built. All of it pressed against him with growing intensity. The young man stood in the paddock at dawn the next morning, watching the sky glow faintly over the ridge. The horse stood beside him, stronger than he had ever looked. The wind tugged lightly at the young man's coat, and he felt a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. They were standing at the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. But before anything could be resolved, before the long journey could reach its end, another challenge appeared on the horizon, one that would push them both into the most intense moment yet. The moment the rider stepped into the arena with his horse, the world around them felt strangely quiet, as if everything that had happened before had been pulled together into this single point. The crowd shifted and murmured, but he barely heard them. His focus stayed on the horse walking beside him, calm but alert, aware of the energy in the air. For a heartbeat, the young man felt fear try to claw its way back into his chest, but the horse brushed his shoulder lightly, as if reminding him they had walked through harder days already. He mounted with steady hands, settling into the saddle the way he had practiced many times. The announcer called their names, and the first wave of applause rolled across the arena. Not loud, but warm, the kind of sound that made the young man breathe deeper. He guided the horse forward, and the entrance gate opened wide. They stepped into the arena, and sunlight slid across the horse's back. The young man felt a shift in the animal's muscles, a soft but sure gathering of strength. They began the first pattern slow and controlled, careful not to rush. Each step echoed all the nights they had trained, all the hours spent rebuilding trust and muscle, all the moments they had doubted themselves but kept walking forward anyway. Whispers from the stands floated out. Folks remembered the horse from the auction, remembered how injured he had been, remembered the way he stood forgotten. Now he moved with grace that surprised even those who believed in miracles. The young man heard someone call out that the horse looked better than ever. He didn't dare react, but the words warmed him. As the routine continued, the horse grew more confident. His gait lifted a little higher, his stride lengthened, and his head carried a proud curve that made the young man feel a deep sense of gratitude. This was what he had hoped for. Not just performance, but a chance for the horse to show what had always been hidden behind pain and neglect. They reached the most difficult portion of the routine, a tight set of turns that required balance and trust. This was the section that had caused the most trouble in training. The young man inhaled and loosened his grip slightly, giving the horse space. The horse hesitated at first, a tiny pause that made the crowd lean forward. Then he chose. He shifted his weight and moved smoothly through the first turn, then the next, then the last. The young man held the reins steady but gentle, guiding just enough to keep rhythm without forcing anything. When they finished that section, a wave of applause hit them. Not loud enough to shake the horse, but strong enough to let the young man know what the crowd had just witnessed. For the first time during the event, he allowed a small smile to appear. The horse flicked his ears back as if sensing it, then stepped forward with renewed energy. By the time they reached the final stretch, the crowd felt alive with anticipation. The young man rode with calm focus, but inside him emotions shifted wildly: relief, pride, gratitude, and a quiet disbelief that they had made it this far. When the final signal ended the routine, he halted the horse gently and lowered his head in acknowledgement. The applause that followed felt different this time, full, honest, as if everyone in the stands had waited for this moment almost as much as he had. The young man dismounted and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, not in an exaggerated display, but in a simple, heartfelt embrace. The horse leaned into him, breathing slow and content. It felt like the world around them paused for just a moment, letting that connection settle into the air. After leaving the arena, he walked the horse to the cooling area. Several riders and ranchers approached to offer kind words. One older rancher said he hadn't seen a transformation like that in years. Another told the young man that he had proven something important, not about trophies or reputation, but about what patience and decency can bring out in a living being. The young man nodded quietly, humbled by their words. But the one person he expected to see, the one who had been causing tension for weeks, was nowhere in sight. The buyer had not appeared during the event. The young man wasn't sure if that was relief or uncertainty, but he accepted the peace that came with it. Maybe the man had realized the horse was no longer something he could lay claim to. Or maybe seeing the horse rise again had ended whatever interest he once had. Either way, the young man was grateful for the silence. When the awards ceremony began, he didn't expect much. He knew the horse had done well, but many experienced riders had competed that day. Still, as the announcer began calling out placements, the young man stood with the horse, one hand resting on the animal's shoulder. He listened patiently until the announcer paused for a moment before the final placement. Then the name of the horse was called. Not for first place, but for a special recognition. A ribbon given for heart and resilience. A ribbon given for effort that went beyond performance. A ribbon for a horse who had overcome more than anyone expected. The crowd cheered, and the young man felt something shift inside him. It wasn't about winning. It was about a story coming full circle. He accepted the ribbon and looped it over the horse's halter. The horse blinked calmly, unfazed by the noise around him, as if he understood this moment belonged to him as much as the young man. The young man rested his forehead gently against the horse's cheek, letting the quiet pride settle inside him. On the way home, the air felt different, lighter. The sun dipped low over the hills, coloring the land in warm tones. The horse rode quietly in the trailer, and the young man drove with a peaceful calm he hadn't felt in a long time. When he reached the ranch, he let the horse out into the pasture. The horse trotted forward with strong steps, then turned back toward him as if asking whether he was coming along. The young man stepped over the fence and walked beside him, the world stretching wide around them. The ranch felt safe again. No more strange tracks near the gate? No more shadows on the fence line? Only the wind brushing the grass and the steady rhythm of hooves on the ground. The young man watched the horse graze, the ribbon still hanging loosely from his halter. It looked simple, but it held the weight of everything they had gone through: healing, trust, renewal, hope. Standing there, the young man realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He had saved the horse, yes, but the horse had saved him too. Not from danger, but from the heaviness that life sometimes leaves behind. Training the horse had given him purpose when he needed it most. Caring for the horse had taught him patience and courage he didn't know he had. Their bond had grown in the quiet mornings and late nights, in setbacks and small victories, in every moment when giving up had been the easier choice. As the last light faded, the horse walked back toward him and nudged his shoulder softly. The young man placed a hand on the horse's neck and looked out over the land. Everything was calm now. Everything had settled into its rightful place. The future felt wide open, full of possibilities he had not dared imagine months earlier. The horse stood strong beside him, no longer the injured animal everyone had overlooked at the auction. He was now something far greater, a partner, a survivor. A reminder that even the most broken beings can rise again when someone believes in them. And as the night settled around the ranch, the young man felt certain that this was only the beginning of a life they would build together. A life shaped by trust, resilience, and the quiet strength that grows when two lost souls find each other and refuse to give up. Their story had reached its ending, but it also felt like the start of something new, something bright, something earned. A true happy ending, built not on luck, but on heart.